It's been almost a year since my previous video discussing how much you need to retire in 2025. Since then, Pensions UK has released the updated retirement living standards in June, based on the excellent research by Loughborough University, covering 2024's cost of living. It's slightly confusing, because the data is from 2024, published in 2025, and it's what we use to plan for retirement in 2026. So how much do you actually need to retire? The answer might surprise you. Retirement is far more achievable than you think. Spoiler alert, you do not need 3 million, or even anywhere near £1 million to retire at 65. Of course, if you want to retire a decade earlier at 55, you will need a bigger pot. But exactly how much bigger? To answer this, I modeled 18 retirement plans in timeline using Monte Carlo simulations, each targeting a 90% success rate. I've updated the assumptions from last year to align more closely with real life. And later, we'll look at what it would take to build this nest egg. As a bonus, we'll compare these outcomes to the 4% rule and evaluate whether adopting dynamic withdrawal strategies such as Guyton-Klinger changes anything. There's a lot of data to go through, and we'll close with the key takeaways. If you find topics like this helpful, take a moment to subscribe for future content. Your support is very much appreciated. I've made 3 changes to this year's format. Instead of focusing strictly on the original retirement living standard spending, we'll review options to trim spending, and I'll talk about what I consider extravagant and what I'd cut in an extended bear market, and analyze the effect. Second, I've altered several assumptions in the Monte Carlo modeling to reflect reality more closely, including the gender pension gap, higher mortgage costs, and lower state pension for those retiring at 55. And third, I've estimated the pension contributions required for a range of salaries for those aspiring to retire at 55, under the updated assumptions and Guyton-Klinger guardrails. The goal isn't to save more than your neighbor. The goal is to save enough. This is going to be data heavy, because we're exploring 18 modeled scenarios in timeline. I will use charts extensively to cut through the 18 scenarios. If you want to evaluate retirement options using data, this is for you. But just to be clear, this isn't financial advice. Let's begin with the updated retirement living standards. As before, we're focusing on the moderate lifestyle. A single retiree will need £31,700 and a couple £43,900. That's a modest increase of 1% for singles and just under 2% for couples compared to last year. Food is the biggest contributor to costs, accounting for 21% of total costs for singles and 35% for couples. And here's a snippet of the food costs that Loughborough considered. It's extremely comprehensive. Over the past 5 years, you can see that the spikes in 2022 and 2023 have calmed, and the recent rise in 2024 is modest. You can see this clearly in the Trussell Trust figures too. They distributed a record number of emergency food parcels in this period, exceeding even the peaks of the COVID pandemic. There are a number of semi-extravagant categories in the moderate budget: food and drink, personal goods and services, and clothing and shoes. The updated report gives a summary, and the detail is thorough. For example, food and drink includes alcohol, dining out, and takeaway. Personal goods and services includes hairdressing, perfumes, and beauty treatments. This table summarizes the expenses. I've included the occurrences per item because some costs are weekly, some monthly, and some every 6 weeks. The RLS model is impressively thorough. But here's where I diverge. I'm not convinced ladies will spend £900 on haircuts in retirement, or as a couple, £206 on perfume every year, and £2,500 on clothing and shoes? In retirement? Really? I have no plans to transform my retirement home into a shrine to Imelda Marcos. This highlights opportunities to reduce costs permanently. I've listed the items I would cut by 50 to 75%. You may make different choices, but it shows how useful the RLS model is. And if you're within 5 years of retirement, nothing beats knowing your actual household expenses. Food and drink I've largely left intact. That includes dining out, takeaway, and a weekly bottle of wine. Personally, I'd be concerned for my health doing all of these weekly for the rest of my life, but I understand the intent. This provides a comfortable baseline. This is obviously personal, so let me know in the comments if you would choose differently. But the principle stands. There is plenty of fat you can trim without actually sacrificing your quality of life. Overall, the revised RLS reduces costs by 8%. That may not sound dramatic, but over a 30 to 40-year retirement, that reduction compounds and has a major impact on the required pension pot. Clothing and shoes alone account for 4% of the cut, with other categories contributing 2% each. As Jonathan Guyton, David Blanchett and Derek Tharp found, small permanent reductions can be highly effective. A quick aside on handling a deep, extended bear market early in retirement when sequence risk is most dangerous. I'd make further temporary cuts in non-essentials beyond the permanent reductions. Food-wise, I'd suggest halving alcohol, dining out, and takeaway. But I'd take a sledgehammer to perfumes, clothing and shoes. These are the first things I would put on ice in a bear market. This gives an additional temporary reduction of 10 to 11%. That could make all the difference in an extended downturn. The important part is planning in advance so you know which levers to pull. What would you cut in a downturn? Drop it below in the comments. And this aligns with Bengen's floor ceiling, which allows spending to fall 10% below target in downturns. I think it deserves more attention, because it's the only dynamic withdrawal strategy with an inflation-adjusted floor. Now, how much do you need to save? First, the assumptions. After all, a plan is only as robust as its assumptions. Moderate costs increase slightly. The full state pension is up 4.8% to £12,550. A major change from last year. For those retiring at 55, I've reduced state pension to £11,830, because they are more likely to have around 33 qualifying years at retirement. Crucially, I added mortgage costs. It is not always practical to be mortgage-free by retirement. The reality, it's just another cost to model. Mortgage costs are also higher in 2025. Using the latest data, the average monthly mortgage payment on a house in 2025 is £1,253, or £15,040 annually. For singles, that's £15,040, and for couples, £16,540, 10% higher, because couples are more likely to have larger homes. And I've introduced the gender pension gap, meaning the male partner must save roughly twice the amount of his spouse. Retirement ages are unchanged, though I've dropped the midpoint scenario at 60. The retirement horizon remains 40 and 30 years for singles, and 42 and 32 years for couples, when retiring at 55 and 65. The portfolio in retirement remains 60-40, to reflect a moderately conservative risk profile, and to keep performance comparisons consistent. And as before, I've assumed retirees have only defined contribution pensions, and no stocks and shares ISA. You should absolutely save into an ISA if you can, but pensions remain the priority due to tax relief, employer contributions and generous annual allowance. I have omitted ISAs for simplicity and to stress test pension-only portfolios. All plans were modeled in timeline with Monte Carlo simulations, targeting 90% success plus or minus 0.02%, that is, 2 in 1,000 trials to keep consistency across scenarios. So do you need £1 million to retire? No, nowhere near if you retire at 65. This is consistent with last year's results, slightly adjusted for the higher costs and mortgage payments. I modeled 4 approaches for singles and couples: original RLS costs, revised RLS with permanent cuts, revised RLS with a 1% inflation haircut, and revised RLS with inflation haircut, plus downsizing at 75, releasing £100,000 in real terms. Here are the starting pension pots for retirement at 65. The increases for couples are marginal, exactly as we saw last year. Couples benefit from 2 state pensions and twice the tax allowance. And when you include inflation haircut and downsizing, the required pot for couples is actually lower than for singles. Now overlay retirement at 55. Naturally, the pots are much larger because you must rely on your personal pension for an additional 10 to 12 years before state pension begins. Comparing the revised models to the original RLS costs, the reductions are dramatic. For singles retiring at 65, the pot is reduced by 45%, for couples by almost 55%, compared to the original baseline of £529,000 for singles and £569,000 for couples. That's a reduction of £238,000 for singles and £321,000 for couples. For those retiring at 55, the reduction is smaller, around 25%, but still translates to £223,000 less for singles and £273,000 less for couples. That is a massive reduction. This reduction was achieved with 3 simple steps: permanent cuts reducing annual costs by 8%, a 1% inflation haircut, and a conservative equity release of £100,000 at age 75. These are simple strategies, no complex dynamic withdrawal spending rules, but as you can see, the impact is huge. As a quick aside, you might be surprised by how much heavy lifting a casual job can do to secure your retirement. Working just 1 day a week for 40 weeks covers roughly 13% of your revised living costs. Bump that to 2 days, and you are funding over 25% of your retirement lifestyle through earnings alone. This drastically reduces the pressure on your portfolio, essentially acting as a buffer against market volatility. But here's the thing, couples aren't twice as advantaged because of the gender pension gap, so couples do not have linear earning power. Women earn 13% less on average, and women's pensions are, on average, half the size of men's. A fairer comparison is the per-person pot, specifically comparing a single person against the male partner in a couple. Using per-person comparisons shows a fairly stable difference of around £130,000 when retiring at 65, dropping to £107,000 with downsizing. At 55, the relative gap is stable at about 19%. Saving £107,000 more than your partner is still significant, but it's nowhere near double. And this works both ways. If you meet a partner later in life, chances are your savings are already ahead of what you need as a couple. Now let's look at how much more you need to retire at 55 versus 65. Across all scenarios, the additional amount is fairly consistent, reinforcing that couples don't have a huge advantage over singles once we adjust for the pension gap. Next, let's test the 4% rule. This estimation method suggests you need 25 times your annual expenses to cover a 30-year retirement. It assumes you withdraw 4% at the start and adjust for inflation each year. However, it is worth remembering this was originally modeled on a 50-50 portfolio of US assets. Using the original RLS and the revised RLS with permanent cuts, here's what it looks like for singles retiring at 65. The 4% rule overestimates by 50% and 62%. If you relied on it, you would think you must save for decades longer. For couples, it's even worse. Overestimations of 84% and 112% more than double what you actually need. This highlights how dangerous rules of thumb can be. However, for early retirement at 55 with a 40-year horizon, the 4% rule oddly provides a reasonably accurate estimate, at least under the assumptions we looked at. For singles and couples using the revised RLS with permanent reductions, it's only about 6% off in both directions. It underestimates slightly for singles and overestimates slightly for couples. So if you're aiming to retire early, the 4% rule becomes a decent ballpark. But at 65, it completely fails and overestimates by as much as £535,000. On an average salary of £38,100, that's decades of unnecessary saving. Let's look at withdrawal rates. When retiring at 65, withdrawal rates to cover living costs and mortgage payments before state pension are extremely high, between 9 and 12%. Clearly not sustainable long-term. The withdrawal rates for those retiring earlier at 55 fare better, but hover around 6% for 12 years, markedly higher than Bengen's 4%. However, the withdrawal rates fall significantly after receiving state pension and finishing mortgage payments. And it's these two factors that result in a significantly lower withdrawal rate for the next 30 years, which balances the high initial rates. Those retiring at 65 will then be withdrawing between 3 and 4%, and those retiring earlier at 55 have a more significant drop to around 2%. This is why I oppose the obsession with fixed withdrawal rates. Fixed spending assumptions have no basis in reality and can convince people they must save far more than necessary. What if I told you you could reduce your starting pension pot even further? For those planning to retire at 55, if you adopt Guyton-Klinger guardrails and, I should add, the potential volatility that this entails, then you can reduce this by a further 20%. Singles go from £650,000 down to £535,000. Couples from £789,000 to £630,000. For couples, the male partner needs only £430,000. Relative to the original RLS budget, that's almost a 40% reduction for singles and just over 40% for couples. I must admit, this is a larger reduction than I was expecting. Now that we have the required starting pension pots, let's work backwards and figure out how much you need to contribute to reach them. A few assumptions change from last year. The average salary has risen 4.8% to £38,120. The minimum workplace pension contribution remains 8%, but if you want to retire early at 55, you will need a sizable salary sacrifice. There's no way around that. The average starting age for full-time work is now 22, so people retiring at 55 have 2 fewer years to save. And I've included the gender pension gap, so this means that, For a couple, male partner bears twice the burden for building the pension pot. I recommend a global index fund such as HSBC FTSE All World or Vanguard Global All Cap at 100% equities for most of your working life, gradually de-risking towards, say, 60-40. For modeling, I've used an 80-20 as a conservative stand-in. The gross portfolio returns is 8%, but the real returns, net of inflation and fees, is 5%. If you're retiring at 65, this is straightforward. At an average salary of £38,100, contributing 8% gives you £462,000 over 43 years, comfortably more than enough, as indicated by the negative shortfall values. You need only 6.75% if single, and 4.5% for the male partner. So retiring at 65 is fully viable. Retiring at 55 is more challenging. I won't walk through the detailed calculations, but here's a snapshot. Let's jump straight to the minimum required pension contributions. Again, this is for the revised RLS and the inflation haircut, not the full RLS costs. At the average salary, a single retiree needs to contribute 22.25% over 33 years, and the male partner 18%. This means the single needs an additional 14.25% in salary sacrifice, and the male partner an additional 10%. That is a significant commitment. This is where matching employer contributions become incredibly valuable. If your employer matches 3 or 5%, that's free money, and it makes a real difference. I won't go through all the other income bands, but you can see them clearly in the chart. If you're aspiring to retire early, income increases matter most, along with employer matching and managing lifestyle inflation. I cover these and other strategies to maximize your retirement savings in this video. Now, if you combine the inflation haircut and downsizing at 75 with flexible spending using Guyton-Klinger guardrails, the contribution requirements fall noticeably. Using the average salary of £38,100, the required contribution rate drops to 16.75% for singles and 13% for the male partner. This drop is most significant at lower salaries, including the UK average. Putting the two charts side by side, you can immediately see a drop of 5.5% for singles and 5% for couples. And again, the reduction tapers off as salary rises. The headline: singles need 8.75% more than the minimum workplace contribution, and the male partner needs 5% more. And this is before factoring in matching employer contributions and bonus sacrifice. By combining downsizing with the Guyton-Klinger strategy, you need to sacrifice 5% less from your salary to retire early at 55. Think about that. That is 5% more income you could have been spending and enjoying during those 33 years of working life. In case you haven't noticed, I am not a fat FIRE fan. Let's close with 7 takeaways. First, there's no need to pay off your mortgage. Treat it as another expense and model it accordingly. Second, retiring at 65 is vastly easier than retiring at 55. But with simple strategies, inflation haircut and downsizing, the required pot falls dramatically. Third, dynamic withdrawal strategies, such as Guyton-Klinger, can cut the required pot by a further 20%. Fourth, contributing 8% consistently at the average salary is more than sufficient to retire at 65 on an average salary, provided you remain disciplined and consistent. Fifth, retiring at 55 requires high contributions, but these fall by 5 to 5.5% when combining downsizing with flexible spending. Sixth, if you want to retire early, the two biggest enablers are increasing your earning power and managing lifestyle inflation. And finally, seventh, ignore the media scaremongering. You simply do not need £1 million to retire at 65, or even early at 55. If you found this video helpful, check out this video, where I cover 14 simple and effective strategies to avoid running out of money in retirement. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Thanks again for your support, and I'll see you in the next one.